Have you ever met someone on a cold winter road, not knowing they would change your life forever? Sometimes the most ordinary moments, like a broken car, a kind gesture, or a shared cup of coffee, become the beginning of something we never dared to hope for. If you believe in quiet stories of second chances, of healing, of finding home in unexpected places, stay with us. And if this story touches you, feel free to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing moments that warm even the coldest nights. The Woman by the Mustang in the Snow. The snow had started falling before dawn, thick and silent, muffling the world into a hush Asher Cole both hated and secretly clung to. The Kansas back road stretched out before him like a ribbon of white nothingness, the kind that made a man feel small, invisible, which, truth be told, suited Asher just fine. He gripped the worn steering wheel of his battered pickup, his breath misting in the cab. The heater coughed out lukewarm air, barely holding back the winter that had already crept into his bones. His mind, restless as always in moments like these, drifted toward the bills stacked on the kitchen table, the broken furnace he still hadn't fixed, and the empty chair across from his son at dinner. Always the chair. Asher adjusted the rear view mirror out of habit, even though no one was behind him for miles. He preferred it that way. People meant expectations, and he'd learned the hard way that expectations led to disappointment. He almost missed it at first. The shape on the side of the road was little more than a smudge against the endless white, blue steel under frost, the familiar silhouette of a 1967 Mustang fastback, its hood popped open like a cry for help. Asher slowed instinctively, cursing, under his breath. The last thing he needed was to play Good Samaritan. He had enough on his plate, enough ghosts whispering in the silence. But then he saw her. She stood by the car, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, wearing a coat that belonged in an office, not on a roadside in the dead of winter. Snow clung to her hair, to her lashes, giving her the fragile look of someone who didn't belong here. And yet, there was something in the set of her shoulders, the tilt of her chin, that dared the cold to take her down. Asher rolled down the window. The blast of cold air hit him like a slap. "You stuck or sightseeing?" he called, keeping his voice neutral. She turned slowly, and in the pale morning light, her face struck him. Not just the kind of pretty that made you look twice, but the kind that made you look away, because it stirred something you didn't want stirred. Her eyes, though, were the thing that hit hardest. Gray, sharp, like they'd seen enough disappointment to fill a lifetime. "I was hoping for sightseeing," she replied, voice steady but tight from the cold. Turns out the car had other plans. Her attempt at humor wasn't lost on him, but he didn't smile. He climbed out of the truck, boots crunching on the snow. "Pop the hood," he said, already eyeing the Mustang with a mechanic's instinct. A beautiful car, meticulously maintained, but no match for the Kansas winter. She hesitated, then did as told. Asher leaned in, fingers numbing instantly as he checked the lines, the battery. The engine hissed, defiant but beaten. "Fuel line froze over," he muttered. "Lucky it didn't leave you farther out. You from around here?" She shook her head, brushing snow off her sleeves. "Just passing through." He grunted. That was all she was going to give him, and he didn't ask more. He worked in silence, the only sound the wind carving through the fields around them, and the occasional impatient huff from the Mustang, as if it resented the indignity of breaking down in such an unworthy place. "You're good at this," she said, finally breaking the stillness. Asher didn't look up. "Been fixing things most my life." When the engine sputtered back to life, she let out a breath she probably didn't realize she'd been holding. Asher stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans, the grease mixing with old scars and fresh cold. She reached into a sleek leather purse, one of those kinds that looked like it belonged on a runway not in the middle of Kansas, and pulled out a wad of crisp bills. "How much?" she asked. Asher shook his head. 10-minute fix. Forget it." She blinked as if the idea of someone refusing money was a foreign language. "You sure?" "I'm sure." A long pause hung between them, thick as the fog of their breaths. She tucked the money away slowly, almost reluctantly, as if she wasn't used to owing anyone anything. "Well, thank you, Mr. Asher," he said. the name sticking in his throat like it always did when he said it out loud. "Sarah," she replied. For what it's worth. She climbed back into the Mustang, revved the engine, a purr smooth and arrogant, and pulled back onto the road, tires slicing through the snow as if she owned it. Asher stood there long after the taillights faded, into the gray distance, the cold creeping into his skin like an old lover he never quite managed to shake off. He didn't know her story. Didn't want to. But something in the way she'd looked at him like she'd seen through the grease and the grime, the quiet and the hurt, settled in his chest like a seed in frozen soil. He told himself it didn't matter. People like her didn't come back. And people like him, they knew better than to hope. The man who forgot how to be saved. The snow kept falling through the night. By morning, the world outside Asher's cabin was nothing but a heavy blanket of white silence. The kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful but suffocating, as if the snow had muffled not just the land but every sound inside his chest. He sat alone at the small kitchen table, the same one he'd built years ago with the stubborn hope of filling it with laughter, with family, with something resembling warmth. Now it held only the weight of bills, a chipped coffee mug and a single flickering candle. The old furnace had coughed its last breath 2 days ago. He kept telling himself he'd fix it. Eventually, his son, Elliot, was asleep upstairs. Asher tried not to think about how thin the blankets were, how much colder the house felt this year than the last. Or maybe it wasn't the house. Maybe it was him. He rubbed at the scar along his forearm, an old burn from an engine block back when he'd still cared enough to fix other people's dreams, not just their cars. These days, even that felt like going through the motions. He thought about the woman, the one with the Mustang, the name, Sarah. She hadn't belonged on that road any more than he belonged in her world. Expensive coats, leather gloves, a scent of something expensive clinging to the air even after she'd driven away. People like her didn't break down. And if they did, they got back up like nothing ever happened. Asher, though? He'd stayed down. He told himself that was just the way life worked. Some people climbed mountains. Others learned to live in the shadows they cast. He told himself a lot of things these days. He stood, dragging on his old coat, the one with the busted zipper and stains from winters past, and stepped outside. The cold slapped him hard, stealing. His breath, daring him to feel something. He shoveled a path to the woodpile out of habit, like a man performing rituals he no longer believed in. The sound of an engine broke the quiet. Asher straightened, heart tripping over itself when he saw the Mustang, headlights cutting through the falling snow, pulling into his driveway like it belonged there. It didn't. He walked slowly toward the car, every step weighted with a dozen questions he had no intention of asking. Sarah stepped out, her cheeks flushed from the cold strands of chestnut hair escaping from under a knit cap. She didn't look like the woman from yesterday. She looked smaller, more human. "I need to ask a favor," she said, skipping the pretense. Asher bristled. Favors led to owing, and owing led to disappointment. "There's a storm coming," she continued. "Worse than today. They say the highways will be closed by nightfall. My GPS is useless out here. I need shelter just until the road's clear." Her voice held no trace of pride now, just exhaustion, as if every word cost her more than she wanted to admit. Asher stared at her, at the Mustang, at the kid-sized suitcase. In the back seat he hadn't noticed the day before. His breath came out in a ragged cloud. "This ain't a motel," he muttered. "I know. You can head back to town, find a place." Her shoulders tensed. There is no place. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the groan of the old wind through the trees. Asher clenched his jaw so tight it hurt. He didn't invite people into his home, into his life. Not since Ellen died. Not since he learned the hard way, that good intentions turned into cold beds and empty chairs. But she was shivering. And the kid in the back seat, he couldn't see their face, but he saw the small boot pressed against the window, didn't have the luxury of pride. He cursed under his breath. "You can stay in the garage," he said finally. "It's insulated. Somewhat, I'll bring out extra blankets." Sarah's lips parted like she might argue, but then she nodded. She was smart enough to take what she could get. That night, the garage became more than a graveyard for broken engines and unfinished projects. Asher brought out a space heater, old army blankets, 2 mugs of hot cocoa he didn't bother calling cocoa. It was watered-down coffee with extra sugar, but it was hot. They sat across from each other on overturned crates, the air between them, thick with things neither dared to say. "You live out here alone?" she asked softly, as if the walls themselves might be listening. Asher gave a half shrug. "Me and my boy." Sarah looked toward the dark house, the faint glow of Elliot's nightlight visible through the frosted window. Her face softened. "I have a daughter," she murmured. "She's asleep in the car." "You should bring her in," Asher said, sharper than he meant to. Sarah flinched, but she nodded, disappearing into the cold night to retrieve her child. When she returned, she held the little girl close, bundled in layers of too thin clothes, her face buried in her mother's neck. Asher watched them silently, something raw and aching stirring in his chest. He remembered the way Ellen used to hold Elliot like that, like the world couldn't touch them as long as she was between him and the dark. He also remembered how wrong she'd been. Shelter and silent dinner. The garage had never been meant for people. It smelled of old oil, damp sawdust, and rusted regrets. But that night, with the storm howling outside and the snow stacking like bricks against the windows, it became something Asher hadn't known it could be. It became a shelter. He kept his distance, letting Sarah settle her daughter onto an old army cot he dragged from the attic. She moved like a woman who'd done this before, setting up camp in places that weren't meant to feel like home. She tucked the girl in with the practiced hands of someone who knew how to soothe even when she herself was frayed thin. "She's asleep," Sarah whispered after a while, voice soft enough that it barely stirred the heavy air between them. Asher grunted in acknowledgement. He didn't ask the girl's name. He didn't ask why they were out here in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a vintage Mustang and a suitcase that had seen too many motel floors. He wasn't the asking kind, and truth be told, he didn't think he could handle the answers. The coy silence grew heavier, pressing down on them like the snow piling against the garage door. It was the kind of silence Asher had once been comfortable with, the kind that kept people out, the kind that let him pretend the world beyond these walls didn't exist. But tonight it felt different, crowded, unsettling, like there were too many ghosts in the room and not enough places to hide. He moved to the small workbench in the corner, flicking on the old radio that only caught the weakest AM signals. Static filled the space, followed by the faint hum of some old country ballad that sounded more like a memory than a song. Sarah smiled faintly, the curve of her lips more sad, then amused. "Classic," she murmured. Asher shrugged. "It's that or the sound of the wind." "I'm starting to prefer the wind," she said, though there was no bite in her tone. They sat across from each other on mismatched crates, the space heater humming between them like a nervous mediator. The cocoa, or what passed for cocoa, sat, untouched at first. Then Sarah picked up the mug, cupping it in her hands like it might offer more comfort than it had to give. "It's strong," she said after a sip. "Yeah," Asher replied. "Didn't have marshmallows." For a brief, impossible second, the corner of her mouth twitched upward, and it struck him how strange it felt, seeing someone smile in his garage. He couldn't remember the last time someone had. They ate dinner in near silence, leftover soup heated on the portable stove, old bread warmed over the flame. It wasn't much, but the girl ate like it was a feast. Sarah too, though she tried. To hide her hunger behind small, polite bites, Asher noticed. He noticed everything. "You always on the road?" he asked finally, his voice scraping out like a rusted hinge. Sarah froze for a heartbeat, then nodded. "Lately, yeah." "Running from something?" The words came out harsher than he meant them to, but he didn't apologize. He didn't offer soft landings anymore. Her fingers tightened around the mug. "Running toward something," she said quietly, as if correcting herself more than answering him. He didn't push. He'd learned the hard way that people gave you what they were ready to, and not a damn thing more. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the tin roof, whispering promises of more snow, more cold, more nights like this. Sarah shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. "You can move closer to the heater," Asher offered, surprising himself with the softness in his tone. She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if trying to read between the lines of his weathered face, the scar on his jaw, the tired slump of his shoulders. "You always this warm and welcoming?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Lady, you're sleeping in my garage. That's about as warm as it gets." She smiled again. Small. Sad. Real. They sat like that for a long time. The space heater hummed, the radio crackled, the snow pressed in from all sides. And for a moment, Asher let himself pretend it was enough, that the world was as small as this garage, this night, this fragile, borrowed warmth. But he knew better. When Sarah finally dozed off beside her daughter, her breathing slow and steady, Asher stayed awake, staring at the flickering heater, the shadows on the oil-stained walls, the ghosts he'd never learned to banish. He told himself they'd be gone by morning, that the storm would pass, the roads would clear, and she'd drive away like people always did, and he'd go back to what he knew best. Silence. Solitude. Safety. That's all he needed. That's all he deserved. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. The names behind the snowy glass. The snow didn't let up the next day, or the one after. Asher told himself it didn't matter, told himself they were just strangers passing through a storm, clinging to the same fragile warmth out of necessity, not choice. But the lie started fraying at the edges. Elliot was the first to break the rules Asher had drawn so carefully in his head. The boy wandered into the garage the next morning, rubbing sleep from his eyes, wearing his threadbare dinosaur pajamas that were 2 sizes too small. He blinked at the unfamiliar woman and the sleeping girl, then looked to his father with a silent question. Asher cleared his throat awkwardly. "They're just staying till the road's open," he said. Elliot nodded. In that way kids do when they sense more in the room than adults want to say out loud. He walked right up to Sarah, bold as you please. "Hi," he said, his breath misting in the cold. "I'm Elliot." Sarah smiled softly, her guard dropping a fraction. "Hello, Elliot. I'm Sarah. And this is Lily." The girl, Lily, peeked out from under the blanket, big eyes wide with caution, like a stray kitten too used to being shooed away. Elliot crouched beside her, offering a toy truck missing 2 wheels. "Want to play?" Lily hesitated, then took it with tiny, trembling fingers. Asher looked away. He couldn't watch that kind of hope. Not today. By mid-afternoon, the house, his house, felt different. Lived in. There was laughter, soft and cautious, but laughter all the same. Sarah helped Asher patch the drafty kitchen window with old plastic she found in the shed. There, hands brushing more than once, sending sparks he pretended not to feel. They shared soup again that night, this time at the kitchen table. This time as something dangerously close to a family. But Asher couldn't let himself fall into that trap. Not again. He found her later, standing by the frosted window, staring out at the snow that hadn't stopped falling since she'd arrived. Her reflection was ghostly, blurred by the condensation. She looked smaller without her coat, wrapped in one of Asher's old flannel shirts she'd borrowed from the laundry pile. It hung off her like a memory. "You really think it'll let up tomorrow?" she asked softly, not looking at him. "Maybe," Asher said. He didn't believe it. She exhaled, fogging up the glass, tracing a line through the mist with her finger. "My daughter keeps asking when we can go back to the city. I keep telling her soon. I don't know if I'm lying to her anymore." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, keeping the distance safe. "City kid, huh?" Sarah smiled faintly. "Born and bred. She hates the cold. I guess I do too. Then why are you out here?" She turned then, meeting his gaze with an honesty that startled him. "Because sometimes the place you thought was home isn't, and you have to keep driving until you find a place that feels like breathing again." Asher didn't have an answer for that. After a long pause, she added quietly, "You never asked who I am. I figured you'd tell me when you wanted to." Silence stretched again, but it wasn't heavy this time. It was waiting. Finally, she spoke. My name's not just Sarah, it's Sarah Lancaster. He blinked, the name slamming into him harder than he'd expected. Lancaster, as in Lancaster Motors, as in old money, boardrooms, shiny press releases about family dynasties. He'd read the name in magazines, seen it on billboards, and now she was in his house wearing his old shirt, eating his canned soup. You're kidding, he muttered, though he knew she wasn't. I wish I was, she whispered, her voice catching on the edge of something sharp. His body stiffened, that old instinct to pull back, to retreat, clawing its way up his spine. What the hell are you doing out here then? His voice came out harsher than he meant, but the words had been building all along, hadn't they? She flinched but didn't waver. Running. Same as you, I think. He scoffed. I'm not running. She tilted her head, studying him with those piercing gray eyes that made him feel like she saw right through the layers he'd spent years building. You sure about that, Asher? He swallowed hard, turning away, focusing on the old photograph of Elliot on the fridge, back when things still felt whole. I lost everything, he admitted quietly. Wife, job, home. Guess I figured if I stayed still long enough, the world might forget I was still breathing. Sarah's expression softened. I lost everything too, she said. Just in a bigger house. For the first time he saw it, not the heiress, not the socialite, but the woman, the mother. The cracks beneath the surface, the exhaustion in her smile. They stood like that for a while, the snow whispering against the glass, two people too broken to admit they might still need saving. You don't have to tell me anything else, Asher said finally. You're here. That's enough. Her breath caught. For a moment it looked like she might say more, but then she nodded. Thank you. He nodded back, the words sitting heavy in the space between them. And for the first time in a long time, Asher realized maybe names didn't matter as much as what you did with them. Maybe the names they'd both been hiding behind were just ghosts. Too, the week that almost felt like Christmas, the storm didn't break the next day, or the day after that. It lingered, thick and heavy, wrapping the town in a stillness that pressed into bones, into breath, into the hollows of Asher's small cabin. He told himself every morning that they'd leave when the roads opened, when the sky turned forgiving again. But days passed and they didn't leave. Something inside him, the old stubborn parts, kept whispering that he should want them gone, that this wasn't their place, that letting them stay was dangerous. But another part, quieter, older, buried deeper, had started to thaw, slow and reluctant, like the drip of icicles in weak sunlight. The house changed in small ways first. Lily's laughter joined Elliot's, blending into the old walls like the scent of cinnamon Sarah added to the morning oatmeal. Sarah fixed the wobbly cabinet hinge in the kitchen without being asked. She folded the blankets with a precision Asher had stopped caring about long ago, and when the town radio crackled out warnings of more snow on the way, Sarah didn't flinch. She stayed. Elliot pulled out the old Christmas lights from the attic, a tradition Asher had quietly buried since Ellen died, and Sarah helped untangle them by the dim glow of the fireplace. Her fingers worked methodically, as if untying the knots in the cords could also untangle something in herself. You got a tree? She asked that night, holding up a string of half-dead bulbs. Asher shook his head. Stopped bothering a while back. Sarah tilted her head, studying him the way she always did when she was about to challenge him. Maybe it's time to bother again, she said softly, and somehow, that's how Asher found himself, 2 days before Christmas, trudging through waist-deep snow behind his son and Lily, who led the charge into the woods behind the house. Sarah followed, her scarf trailing behind her like a banner in the wind. They found a tree. Not perfect, not even close. Crooked, a little sparse, leaning to one side. But when they dragged it back to the cabin, when they set it in the corner and draped it with mismatched lights and homemade paper stars, well, it was perfect enough. For the first time in years, the cabin glowed. They baked cookies with whatever, they could find in the cupboards, overbaked, too salty, crumbling at the edges, but the kids devoured them like they were feasts. Sarah laughed then, really laughed, a sound that startled Asher, and maybe herself too. It filled the room in a way nothing had since Ellen's last Christmas. They told stories by the fire. Sarah spoke of the city, of lights taller than trees, of parties she never wanted to be at. Asher told old mechanic tales, the kind that made the kids giggle and roll their eyes. They didn't talk about what came after the snow melted, about the Mustang parked outside, waiting for a road that would eventually open, about the life Sarah had beyond these walls, and the life Asher had stopped dreaming about. They stayed in the now, the fragile, borrowed now. And Asher, despite everything he told himself, let it happen. It wasn't until the fourth night, Christmas, that something cracked. He found Sarah standing outside, boots buried in snow, staring up at the pale shimmer of stars. The cold bit hard, but she didn't seem to notice. "You're gonna freeze," he said quietly, stepping beside her. She smiled faintly, not taking her eyes off the sky. "It's funny," she murmured. "In the city, we never see the stars. Too much noise. Too much everything. Guess out here we've got nothing but stars." "Nothing but stars," she echoed, her breath clouding the air between them. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then she asked, "What was she like?" "Your wife?" The question slipped through his defenses before he could build them back up. He swallowed hard, the ache still raw after all these years. "She was the kind of person who made things feel easy," he whispered, "even when they weren't. She made this house feel like more than wood and nails." Sarah nodded, as if she understood that more than she should have. "Must have been a hell of a woman," she said softly. "She was," Asher whispered. They didn't speak for a while after that. There was nothing more to say. But Sarah didn't pull away. She stood close, their shoulders brushing, her warmth seeping into him like a thing he hadn't realized he'd been craving. When they finally went back inside, the kids were asleep. On the couch, tangled in blankets, the trees' crooked lights flickering in the dark. Asher covered them gently, his rough hands lingering on Elliot's hair longer than usual. Sarah watched him, eyes soft, something unreadable in them. And for a moment, as the snow fell silently outside, as the fire popped inside, as the ache of old grief pulsed beneath his ribs, Asher let himself imagine a different life. One where Christmas didn't feel like a ghost house. One where laughter didn't sound like a foreign language. One where, maybe, just maybe, there was still room for something more. But he knew better than to believe in almost, didn't he? When the blizzard broke through, it happened the day after Christmas. The blizzard came without warning, at least without the kind of warning Asher wanted to believe in. The wind had been building all morning, gnawing at the edges of the old house, whispering threats through the cracks in the walls. Asher knew the signs. He could read storms the way some men read people. This one was different, meaner, and not just the weather. It started when the black SUV pulled into the driveway, its tires slicing through the snow like a predator's grin. Clean, polished, out of place. Asher stood on the porch, the snow stinging his face, watching the vehicle idle too long before the doors finally opened. Two men stepped out. Coats too thin for the weather, eyes too cold for comfort. And behind them a man Asher didn't need an introduction for, Victor Lancaster. He recognized him from magazine covers, from news stories that painted him in gold and power. The man looked the same in person, slick hair, flawless coat, a face that had never known hunger or fear. And now he stood on Asher's porch like he owned the ground beneath it. Sarah appeared behind Asher before he could stop her. She froze when she saw them. Her breath caught. Asher heard it, a quiet gasp that told him everything he needed to know. Victor smiled. But it wasn't the kind that reached his eyes. Well, he drawled like he was greeting an old friend. "Sarah, you've been busy." She straightened, pulling Lily behind her like a shield. "What do you want, Victor?" "What I always wanted," he said, his tone oily smooth. "My family back where they belong. She's not your family anymore, Sarah snapped. Her voice shook, but her spine stayed straight. Victor's gaze flicked past her to Asher, dismissive, calculating. And who's this? The help? Asher didn't flinch. He didn't rise to the bait. Not yet. Leave, Sarah said, more forcefully now. Victor chuckled. Come on, Sarah. Let's not make a scene. I'm offering you a way back. For Lily's sake, if nothing else. She deserves better, Sarah whispered. Victor's smile tightened. The men behind him stepped forward, subtle but deliberate. You think this backwoods mechanic can protect you? Victor sneered. You're still legally my wife, Sarah. I can take her back. I can take everything. Asher's hands clenched at his sides. The old part of him, the part that knew how to stay quiet, to stay safe, to stay invisible, urged him to step back. But the man he used to be, the one Ellen had believed in, the one Elliot still looked up to, rose to the surface like a bear from hibernation. He stepped forward, planting himself between Sarah and Victor. You're not taking anyone, Asher said, his voice low, steady, colder than the snow swirling around them. Victor laughed. And what are you going to do? You think standing on a porch with your pride is going to stop me? I'll bury you, Mr. Cole. You think the law gives a damn about a washed-up mechanic in a town nobody remembers? Asher didn't blink. You want to fight me in court? Fine. But you step foot on this land again without a badge or a warrant, and I promise you'll regret it. For a long, tense heartbeat, the only sound was the howl of the wind tearing across the open fields. Victor studied him, lips curled in disdain. Then, almost too casually, he turned to Sarah. You always did. Have a thing for broken men. Sarah didn't answer. She just pulled Lily closer, her jaw clenched, her eyes blazing. Victor tipped an imaginary hat. Enjoy the snow, he said, then climbed back into his SUV, his men following. The vehicle roared away, tires spinning, flinging slush in its wake. Asher stood still, watching the taillights fade into the whiteout. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, not anymore. From the weight of a choice he'd been running from for far too long. When he finally turned, Sarah was crying, not sobbing, not breaking, but silent tears streaking down her flushed cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't want to drag you into this. You didn't drag me anywhere, Asher said hoarsely. She met his gaze, searching it for something. Maybe forgiveness, maybe permission to fall apart. He gave her both. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him without asking, without hesitation, and in the middle of the blizzard, in the eye of a storm that had nothing to do with snow, Asher held her, tightly, fiercely, without flinching. I thought I'd forgotten how to fight for something, he whispered into her hair, but I haven't. Not when it's you, not when it's her. She sobbed once, muffled against his chest. And for the first time, Asher wasn't afraid of the storm, because he'd finally stopped standing on the porch, waiting for life to pass him by. He was in it. Messy, dangerous, real, and he wasn't backing down, the man who chose to stay in the storm. The blizzard raged through the night, but inside the old cabin, the air grew heavier with a different kind of weight. After Victor left, the walls felt too thin, the locks too flimsy. The storm outside no longer seemed like the biggest threat. Sarah sat by the fire, arms wrapped tightly around Lily, as if afraid that if she let go, the girl might vanish. The flicker of the flames caught the wet sheen in her eyes, but she didn't cry. Not again. She was past crying. Asher stood by the window, staring out into the swirling dark, every muscle tense, coiled, ready. He kept replaying the moment Victor had stood on his porch like a king surveying a pawnshop, the way he'd looked through Asher past him, as if Asher wasn't even a person worth noticing. It stung in ways Asher didn't want to name. You should have let him take me, Sarah said finally, her voice hollow, frayed at the edges. Asher turned sharply. What the hell are you talking about? She shook her head, pulling Lily closer. He won't stop, Asher. He doesn't know how. And you can't win against men like him. His fists clenched at his sides. I don't care if I can't win. She blinked, startled by the steel in his voice. For years, he said quietly, I thought keeping my head down was surviving. That staying quiet, staying small was the only way to make it through. But all I was doing was disappearing. He crossed the room in 3 steps, kneeling in front of her, meeting her broken gaze head on. I'm done disappearing. Her lips trembled. Asher, you don't have to. Yes, I do. He cut in, voice cracking under the weight of it. Because if I don't fight for you, for Lily, for Elliot, who the hell am I? What's the point of breathing if I can't stand for something when it matters? Silence stretched between them, thick and raw. Then softer, almost a confession, he whispered. I thought I didn't know how to love anymore, Sarah. I thought that part of me died with Ellen. But you, he swallowed hard. You make me want to remember. Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them back. Asher, I'm scared. Me too, he admitted. But we can be scared together. She reached for him then, her fingers trembling as they brushed his jaw, tracing the old scar like she was learning the map of him for the first time. He leaned into her touch. Let her feel the truth of him, the man who was scared, tired, flawed, but who had finally chosen to stay. That night, they slept in the same room, the same bed, fully clothed, fully raw, tangled not in lust but in something far more dangerous. Trust. It was messy, it was tentative, it was everything Asher hadn't let himself want for years. He woke before dawn, the storm finally breaking into an uneasy hush. The world outside was wrecked. Snow drifts waist deep, branches snapped under the weight, the town swallowed whole. But inside the cabin something new had taken root. Sarah stood by the window holding Lily against her chest, whispering soft promises into the little girl's ear. Asher watched them, heart aching in ways he didn't have words for. He knew the fight wasn't over. Knew Victor would be back, meaner, smarter, the kind of man who didn't take no for an answer. But Asher didn't feel small anymore. He walked over to the hearth, grabbed the battered wooden toolbox, and began laying out the old locks, screws, hinges he'd been meaning to fix for years, but never found the will to. You planning to rebuild the whole house? Sarah asked softly. Thinking about it, he replied. She smiled. I like that. He nodded, focused on the work, on the way the screws bit into the wood, the way the hammer felt in his calloused hand. It felt good. It felt like choosing to stay. By the time the sun crested weakly over the snow, Asher had reinforced every door, every window. He'd rigged alarms from old bike bells and fishing line. It wasn't much, but it was something. Elliot helped him paint a sign and nail it to the fence, crooked and defiant. Private property. Trespassers will be sorry. It was a joke, a bad one. But when Sarah laughed, a real body-shaking laugh that startled even her, Asher felt something crack open in his chest. The town sheriff showed up that afternoon, bundled in layers, his breath huffing in the cold. Heard you had some visitors, the sheriff said, eyeing the SUV track still frozen in the snow. Yeah, Asher replied simply. You want me to make some calls? See if we can keep an eye on the place? Asher hesitated. For a moment, the old him wanted to say no, to handle it himself, to shut the world out. But he didn't. Yeah, he said. Thanks. The sheriff tipped his hat. About damn time you let folks in, Asher Cole. Asher watched him leave, the words settling into him like the first light of spring. Maybe the sheriff was right. Maybe staying wasn't about building bigger walls. Maybe it was about opening the damn door. Ashes in the snow. It happened on a Tuesday. Snow had begun to melt just enough to reveal the wreckage underneath. A driveway packed with ruts of frozen mud. A sky that promised more storms and a world that still held its breath. Asher had just finished replacing the busted lock on the garage door when he smelled the smoke. At first, he thought it was the old wood stove, maybe a clog in the chimney. but the smell was wrong. Too thick, too bitter. The kind of smell that didn't whisper warmth but screamed destruction. He dropped the wrench, heart pounding, and ran outside. The garage. The place that had been his refuge, his confessional, his second skin for years, was burning. The flames licked greedily at the old timbers, curling black smoke into the pale sky. The Mustang parked inside hissed and moaned as the fire devoured it whole. Sarah's screams cut through the roar of the fire, her hands clutching Lily as they stood helpless in the snow. "No!" she sobbed. "No! No! No!" Asher grabbed the hose, knowing it was pointless even as the water froze in the air before reaching the flames. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands blistering from the heat and the cold in equal measure. The sheriff arrived minutes later. Too late. Always too late. Neighbors gathered, silent shadows in parkas and scarves, watching as the only thing Asher had left of his old life, his tools, his workshop, his pride, collapsed into a heap of glowing embers and bitter smoke. Victor hadn't needed to say a word. The message was clear enough. Asher stood there long after the last flame died, the snow swallowing the ashes like they'd never been. Sarah approached him slowly, her face streaked with soot and tears. She touched his arm, tentative, like she wasn't sure if she had the right. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He didn't speak, couldn't. He just stared at the ruins. That night, the cabin felt colder than ever, the walls shrinking in around them, the silence sharp and suffocating. Elliot cried quietly into his pillow. Lily wouldn't let go of her mother's hand. And Asher sat in the dark, the scar on his chest throbbing like a wound ripped wide open. It wasn't just the garage. It wasn't just the tools. It was the last piece of himself he'd believed he could protect. Gone. Ashes in the snow. Sarah sat across from him, the firelight throwing shadows over her hollow face. "We can leave," she said softly. "We can go somewhere he can't find us," but Asher shook his head, slow, deliberate. "No." Her brows furrowed. "Asher, no," he repeated, his voice rough and low. "I'm done running." Her breath caught, tears brimming again. He stood, moving to the window, staring out at the town that had watched him fall apart for years, the town he'd tried to hide from. Maybe it was time they saw him standing. "I'll rebuild it," he said quietly. Sarah blinked. "You can't." "Yes, I can." He turned to her, something fierce and aching burning in his eyes. "He took everything. Again. And I'm still standing." She crossed the room then, wrapping her arms around him like she had in the storm. Only this time, they both knew what they were holding on to. "You're not alone," she whispered against his chest. He swallowed hard, holding her tighter. "I know." They stayed like that for a long while. Later, after the kids had finally fallen asleep, Sarah found him sitting by the cold ashes of the hearth, staring into the dark. "You don't have to be the strong one all the time, you know," she said, softly. He shook his head. "I'm not strong, Sarah. I'm just done being scared." Her lips trembled. "So am I." She sat beside him, their shoulders brushing, their silence heavier than words. And as the snow fell outside, soft, relentless, like a prayer unanswered, they made a vow, unspoken, but understood. They wouldn't let the past win. Not this time. No, matter what it cost. A town that gathers around the fire. The morning after the fire, the world was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but hollow. Asher sat on the porch staring at the blackened wreckage of his garage, the snow covering it like a burial shroud. Elliot sat beside him, small legs swinging over the porch steps, saying nothing. Asher knew there were no words to make sense of it for his boy. He wasn't sure there were words to make sense of it for himself. That's when Tobias Knox showed up. The old man didn't knock, just shuffled up the drive with his mangy hound and a thermos of black coffee Asher knew tasted like dirt and comfort. "Shame about the garage," Tobias said, as if commenting on the weather. Asher nodded. Yeah. They sat in the cold for a long minute before Tobias cleared his throat. Me and some of the boys were thinking, might be time you let us help. Asher blinked. Help? Yeah, Tobias said. Help. You remember what that is, don't you, Cole? Asher opened his mouth to argue, closed it, looked away, because the truth was, he didn't. Not really. Not since Ellen. But that night something shifted. It started with Tobias showing up with lumber. Then the sheriff brought nails. Then Mary Lou from the diner arrived with sandwiches and coffee that didn't taste like boiled socks. By dusk, the whole damn town seemed to be in his yard. People Asher hadn't spoken to in years. People who'd written him off as the grumpy mechanic who kept to himself. They didn't ask permission. They just picked up hammers, rolled up their sleeves, and went to work. Sarah stood on the porch, her hand in his, watching the town she thought would shun her show up like family. They don't even know me, she whispered, her voice cracking. They don't have to, Asher said. They know what it means to lose something, that's enough. She looked at him then. Really looked at him, and he saw the tears she tried to hide. Maybe he understood now why Ellen had loved this place so fiercely. Because when the world kicked you down, this town got up beside you. They worked through the week in the cold, in the slush, in the stubborn winter sun. They built a new garage, built new walls, repaired old ones. But more than that, they built something Asher hadn't realized he was missing. A community. On the final day, Tobias handed Asher a sapling, thin, fragile, barely more than a stick in the frozen earth. What's this? Asher asked. Tobias grinned around his cigarette. Promise tree. Town tradition. You plant it when you decide to stop running from whatever it is you've been running from. Asher looked at the sapling, then at Sarah, then at the house behind, them glowing warm against the snow. He knelt, dug into the cold ground with numb hands, and planted it in the center of the yard. Sarah joined him, her hands brushing his as they pressed the soil back in place. They didn't say the words out loud. They didn't have to. Later, the town gathered around the fire pit Asher built from the old stones that survived the garage fire. They shared cocoa, burnt marshmallows, and quiet stories. Elliot and Lily chased each other through the snow, their laughter the sweetest sound Asher had heard in years. Sarah sat beside him, their shoulders touching, the firelight reflecting in her tired, hopeful eyes. You still scared? She asked softly. He thought about it, thought about the fire, about Victor, about the ghosts that still haunted them. Yeah, he admitted, but I'm not running anymore. She smiled, brushing snow from his hair, letting her hand linger on his cheek. Good, she whispered, because neither am I. Asher reached for her hand, fingers lacing through hers. Solid. Sure. Like the foundation they were building together. Maybe they wouldn't win every fight. Maybe the world would throw more storms at them. But for tonight, for this fragile, borrowed night, they had a town behind them. They had each other. And that was enough. The promise tree swayed in the winter wind, its branches bare, its roots shallow. But Asher knew better than anyone that the strongest things grew in the hardest soil. And this tree? It would grow, because they would stay to watch. Beneath the promise tree in the snow winter began to loosen its grip by the end of February. The snow still clung to the ground in heavy, stubborn patches, but the mornings came with a faint scent of thaw. The days stretched longer, the sun casting soft gold across the cabin porch, and the promise tree stood at the center of it all, bare branches trembling against the pale sky, roots dug deep beneath the frozen earth, waiting. It wasn't much to look at yet, but Asher knew better than most that the best things took time. Sarah stayed. They never had a conversation about it, never made a grand declaration. She just stayed. She moved her suitcase inside, unpacked Lily's things, filled the drawers that had sat empty for too long. She brought warmth into corners of the house Asher had forgotten to notice. They rebuilt slowly. Not just the garage, not just the rooms, but themselves. Asher started taking in repair work again, not because he needed the money, though they did, but because he liked the rhythm of it, the sense of purpose in his hands. Sarah started baking, painting, helping Elliot with his homework. She filled the walls with life in ways that went beyond pictures or decorations. And at night, when the house settled into its quiet creaks and sighs, they sat together by the fire, shoulders touching, no words needed. It wasn't perfect. Some days were hard, some nights the ghost came back, but they stayed. That was the difference. One crisp March afternoon, they sat beneath the promise tree, wrapped in blankets, watching Lily and Elliot build a crooked snowman with the last of the slush. Asher held Sarah's hand, his fingers tracing lazy circles on her wrist. "You think it'll survive?" she asked, nodding at the sapling. He smiled faintly. "Yeah. Might not look like much now, but give it time." She rested her head on his shoulder, her breath warming the hollow place under his jaw. "Kind of like us, huh?" she murmured. He chuckled. "Yeah, like us." They watched the kids laugh, heard their joy fill the air, and for once Asher didn't flinch at the sound. "You ever think about forever?" Sarah asked softly, after a long pause. He considered it, letting the idea roll over in his mind like the wind whispering through the branches. "Used to," he admitted. "Used to think forever was something you promised at an altar. Now?" He turned, brushing her hair behind her ear, letting his hand linger on her cheek. "I think forever's a choice you make every day, even when it's hard, especially then." Her eyes shimmered. "That's a better kind of forever, I think." He kissed her then, slow and certain, not with the urgency of people who feared losing something, but with the tenderness of people who knew what it meant to stay. That night, they ate dinner at the old kitchen table, the one that had once felt too big for just Asher and Elliot. Now it felt just right. Sarah sat beside him, Lily across from Elliot, their laughter mingling with the crackle of the fire. After the kids went to bed, Asher stood in the doorway of the nursery, the one they'd fixed up together. The one that held Lily's drawings, Elliot's old toys, and the soft, steady hum of a home finally lived in. He watched them sleep, their faces soft and peaceful in the glow of the nightlight, and something inside him, a place he thought had turned to stone long ago, finally exhaled. Later, as he sat by the hearth with Sarah curled beside him, she handed him a letter. "What's this?" he asked. "Something I wrote the night the garage burned down," she said softly. He opened it carefully, the paper worn, the words trembling. "Dear Asher, if you're reading this, it means you stayed. I wanted to tell you then, but I was too scared. Scared that you'd think I wasn't worth fighting for, scared that I'd hurt you more than you were already hurting. But the truth is, you saved me, not by fixing my car, not by fighting Victor, but by letting me stay. You taught me that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It's about showing up, even when you're scared, especially then. Thank you for showing up, Asher. Love, Sarah." Asher folded the letter slowly, pressing it against his heart. "You didn't have to write this," he whispered. "I know," she said, her voice catching. "But I needed to." He kissed her knuckles, the gesture simple, steady. Then, "Maybe it's my turn to say it out loud," he said. She looked up, eyes questioning. "I love you, Sarah," he said. "I thought I forgot how, but I didn't. You reminded me." Her tears fell then, soft as the snow outside. "I love you too," she whispered. The promise tree swayed gently in the night breeze, its branches bare, its roots growing deeper by the day. They didn't need a wedding. They didn't need forever carved in stone. They had this: a tree in the snow, a house rebuilt, a family chosen. And every day, they would choose each other again. If this story touched your heart, feel free to stay with us, because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that heal the deepest wounds. And sometimes a little kindness is all it takes to build a family. If this story found a quiet place in your heart, if it reminded you that sometimes family is not what we're born into, but what we choose to stand beside, then stay with us. There are always more stories of hope, of healing, of people brave enough to open the door again. Feel free to like, subscribe, and let these small, quiet stories keep you company on the days you need them most.